right. And hello to people that might be watching this in the future. Uh, this is part two of Great Themes of the Bible. So just to kind of recap, we did the Biblical Interpretation 101. We did part one and two of that. And now we're doing these Great Themes of the Bible. It's four of those. So this is the second one. So we got two more, and then we'll do the last part of the Biblical Interpretation 101. All right. And I should I should make these handouts available online. Um, I don't know if I should because we purchased these. So anybody that's watching this later, if you want a handout, you come see me or send me an email. All right. So the first one, and that was the one that I was going out of town, and so I pre-recorded it. It was online only, the first one of the Great Themes of the Bible, and that was the one that was good, that God is with us. Um, and that's a theme that we can trace throughout the whole Bible, that not that God removes all our problems, but that God is always with us in the midst of them. And we looked at several examples, and we talked about Joseph, and Joseph had a rough time. uh, but throughout the story, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph, but the Lord was with Joseph, but the Lord was with Joseph. And we're going to talk about Israel and Egypt now, and uh, uh, today, and they were in slavery for 400 years. But you know God did not forget about them, that God did deliver them. And then you think about going on through to the Babylonian exile. They were in exile for 70 years, but God returned them to the land. So uh so the basic theme last week was, God is with us. That doesn't mean that everything is always great, but God never leaves us. God never abandons us. And Jesus said that, you know, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age, because he said, I won't leave you as orphans. I'm going back to the Father, but I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit to be with you forever. So, and then we traced that through last week, all the way through to the book of Revelation, where you have the New Jerusalem, and the angel says, behold, the dwelling of God is among men, is among humans, and God will be with them and will be their God. And what is that but the same covenant promise that God made to Abraham? I will be with you and will be your God, and to your descendants after you. So that's the first great theme of the Bible. And we could call that, it was sort of like a Reader's Digest version of like covenant theology. That's the heart of the covenant is, I will be your God and you will be my people. So that was the first great theme. And the second one is today, and is that God is on the side of the slave. God is on the side of the poor, and the those who get stepped on, and those who are reviled, etc. And the way it starts, um, it says, we are told in Exodus that God visited Egypt. And many Bible scholars agree that more than any other event, this Egypt visitation created God's people. Now we have in the book of Genesis, we have all the stories from Adam and Eve all the way up to Joseph and his brothers, and how the Israelites came to be in Egypt. But then when uh when Exodus opens, they're they're in Egypt. They've been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And the stories that we have leading up to that uh were all before Hebrew was a written language. And so it was, so it was those were written down from the perspective of somebody after the fact looking back, but from the experience of the Israelite people, you know, they had been in Egypt for 400 years, and it seems like during that time, I mean, it's kind of like a silent period. Uh, uh, it says there arose a new Pharaoh over Egypt that didn't know about Joseph. There's a huge
Yeah, but Joseph's been gone for
yeah, there's a
he's been
huge
there for
time
centuries.
span between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, and so it's not like if you like on Batman or something where he's like in our last episode,
Yeah.
which was just like a few minutes ago or the day before, whatever. So this is 400 years later, and so the the appearance of God to Moses in the burning bush is the first time it seems that God has spoken to somebody in 400 years. Because God talked to Adam and Eve, and God talked to Abraham, and God talked to Jacob, and but it's been that long since there's been that kind of word from God. And it's interesting because it talks about the contrast between Egypt and the Israelites. And so the Egyptians believed uh, that the Pharaoh was a manifestation of one of the gods on earth. Uh, so it says Egyptian religion maintained direct communication between king and deity. In fact, the Egyptian god Horus was thought to be incarnate in several pharaohs. So kind of like the Dalai Lama, the uh, in the Buddhist thought, the Dalai Lama is the same person that has just keeps coming back in these different lives. Well, that's how they thought about the Pharaoh, that the Pharaoh was one of the gods, and he just kept coming back in the persona of a new Pharaoh. And that's why, you look at the tombs, and they have these elaborate and all the gold and everything. Well, they thought that these pharaohs were one that was part of their pantheon of gods. Um, and so the the reverence that they had for the pharaoh was like the reverence you would give to a deity. But then it says, but when the God of the Bible visits Egypt, this concept is completely overturned. And God doesn't God, the Egyptians think, well, there's the Pharaoh is one of the gods, or at the very least, Pharaoh has got like this direct line to God or to the gods. But then when Yahweh comes and it's to Moses, who is the son of slaves. He had been adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, but then he, had to get out of there because he killed somebody, uh, and so he's living as a shepherd off in another land, and so God comes to this shepherd out in the land of Midian, who is the son of slaves, and and sends him back. Well, he says to go to Pharaoh, but he sends him to Pharaoh to say, God says, these slaves are my people, and you have to let them go. And so the whole Exodus story is a clash between the God of the Bible and the gods of the Egyptians, and they thought that the Pharaoh was the manifestation of one of those gods. Uh, and so, these Hebrews had been nobody, as it says, they were less than zero on the human scale. They were just uh, workers.
Pyramid border.
Yeah, free labor for Pharaoh. And so, but God comes along and says, "No, hey, come on in."
Two present, one party.
That's right. -5, but there you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we just turned the corner. We just turned the corner onto page 2. So you're right in time. But like it says, God is possessed by this strange passion of being on the side of the slaves. He doesn't come and he doesn't talk to Pharaoh. He talks to Moses. And the a lot of people think, the 10 plagues are described, that each one of those plagues has to do with uh, a different Egyptian god, that in each case it's like the God of Scripture is defeating a different god of the Egyptians. And then of course the last one is, it's Pharaoh, it's Pharaoh's own son is killed. And if they believe Pharaoh is one of the gods, and then that means his son would be the next god in line. And even he's killed by this God. So, God is overturning the hierarchy. He's overturning the way things are. The Egyptians were, they thought they had like direct line to the heavens, and the Hebrews were nobodies. But God comes in and says, "No, the nobodies, that's who I'm interested in. That's who I want. And I'm calling them out. And they're my people, and that's who I'm concerned for, are these slaves, these nobodies that you're oppressing." So then we get to so they do, God does rescue them from slavery, and then they get to Mount Sinai, and God gives them the law. And so the law is a lot more than 10 Commandments. Of course, we read in the book of Exodus. That's usually when people make a New Year's resolution. They're going to read through the Bible. If they don't get bogged down in Exodus, they're going to get bogged down in Leviticus. Uh, uh, and because that's what it is. There's tons and tons of laws in Exodus. In Exodus, you've got like all these instructions on every like piece of furniture in the tabernacle, and how you're going to make the curtains and all this stuff. And then you got them building it, and then so it's like a repeat of all that. But then you've got all these different laws, and then Leviticus is just law after law, case laws, case laws, case laws of, well, what do you do if this happens? And what do you do if this happens? And so all of Leviticus is like taking the law that is spelled out in Exodus and then applying it to like every conceivable situation that might arise, so it's a little tedious. But in the law, and then Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomy is the Greek name for the book, and that means second law, because Deuteronomy is largely taken up with these long speeches of Moses, before the Israelites go into the promised land. And he knows he's not going to go because God's already told him he can't go. It is sad. It is sad. It's kind of like
Because he got mad, right?
it's kind of like David. It's kind of like David with the temple. David's the one that goes out and gets all the wood and gets all the gold and gets all the stuff. But then God's like, "Oh no, you're not gonna build the temple. Your son's gonna build the temple." So it's like, it's with Moses. "Oh, you're not gonna, you've gotten them ready, but Joshua's gonna take them in, not you." And so it's kind of like Moses' farewell address, or several farewell addresses of Moses. But along with that, he restates the Ten Commandments, and he restates, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor as yourself. And so because of these things, that's why we call it Deuteronomy, which means the second law, because it's like a second time that Moses is giving them the law that we find first time in Exodus. So in Exodus and Deuteronomy, we see that these laws repeatedly convey a special passion, this, as it says earlier, this strange passion that God has for the poor, the widow, the orphan, the slave, the alien, uh, because it's clear that this God remains very much the same God who visited Egypt. I mean, this is his whole shtick, is that he's on the side of the slave. And so we've got just some examples here. This is on page 2. You should not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do, my wrath will burn, and your wives shall become widows, and your children shall become orphans. Well, that's pretty harsh. But I mean, that just shows how serious this is. Of course, in that culture, if you were a widow or if you were an orphan, then you had nothing. You had no means of support. Uh, and then you should not pervert the justice due to your poor in their lawsuits. Take no bribe, for a bribe subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Um, and then in Deuteronomy, if there is anyone, if there is among you anyone in need, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. Open your hand willingly to meet the need. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought. Give liberally and be ungrudging when you do. Now, that section there is what Jesus quotes from when, remember, the woman comes and has this expensive perfume, and she pours it out on Jesus's head, and Judas, of all people, was like, oh, she could have taken that, sold it, and given that money to the poor. And Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. And some people have taken that to mean, well, there's always going to be poor people, so why bother? Oh, well, poor will you always have with you. But what Jesus is quoting from this part of Deuteronomy right here, and what it says is that because you will always have poor people with you, don't ever stop being generous to them. Don't ever stop. So Jesus isn't saying, well, yeah, we're always going to have poor people, like who cares? That's not at all. And he's saying, well, you should give to the poor, because he follows that up. He says you should give to the poor all the time. Because he follows it up, says she's anointing me in advance for my burial, because he knows that this is just a few days before the crucifixion. So he knows that he's about to be crucified. And so he's not saying don't be generous to the poor. He's as a matter of fact just quoting from a part of the Bible that says, because you will always have the poor with you, you should always be generous to the poor. But he's saying this is you know, this is an occasion. This is what she's doing is good and right. Uh, so it's not like an either or. It's a both and. He's not saying, well, you know, anointing him with this was bad because we have poor people. It's like, well, she can do this and this is good, and you should also give to the poor. That's also good. It's not like a Chinese menu. We have to choose one from column A and one from column B. It's both and. Also in the law, in Leviticus 25, you have this thing called the year of Jubilee. If you've heard about the year of Jubilee before.
Give everything back, right?
Yeah. So when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, and the land is all divided up amongst the tribes, and this tribe gets this plot of land, and so within each tribe, then each family within that tribe has their own little homestead, their own little plot of land, um, except for the Levites, and that which is the priestly tribe, and they're scattered all over the land. And that's uh, where the tithe comes from, because the tithe was you were supposed to take a tenth of your crops and your uh, flocks and all of this and give it to the Levites because they didn't have any land. If you don't have any land, you can't grow food. You can't raise sheep. It was to support them, right? And it was to go to the temple, and the temple like took care of all the priests. And it said if you live too far from Jerusalem, that you can't just like bring your food, and they had like literal storehouses for food for the priests, there. It said if you live too far, you can give the food or the crops or the flocks or whatever to a Levite who does live near you, who will sell those things and bring the money to Jerusalem. And so the whole principle of the tithe was to support the priests because the priests didn't have land. Uh, People still would get, people would, just like today, stuff happens, and sometimes people would need to sell their land, or they would, uh, you know, hire themselves out as an indentured servant, become an indentured servant to somebody, uh, because of debts or whatever problems they may have, financial problems they may have. So every 50th year, all of the land would revert back to the original owners, to the original families. And all of those indentured servants would be set free. And all debts would be canceled every 50 years. Uh, and so it's kind of based on the Sabbath principle, because every after every 6 days you have the seventh day, and that's a Sabbath. And they were also supposed to have a Sabbath for the land. This was a long time before they knew about rotating crops. But every seventh year, they're supposed to let the land rest. But then after 7 sevens, that's 49 years. And so after 7 sevens, then you would have this 50th year, which is the Jubilee. It's really interesting that in the prophets, I think it's in Isaiah, where Isaiah actually like gets onto the people for like not being generous or like not lending money if somebody is in need. And it says, somebody comes to you and they ask you to lend money, and you're like, oh no, I'm not going to do that because the year of Jubilee is next year, and so I'll never get that money back. And the prophets say, no, you go ahead and do it. Even though the year of Jubilee is coming up, you go ahead, like it's again, this whole idea, because there will always be poor among you, you should always be generous. Even if you're basically, you're about to get fleeced. Um, Still, you should help the poor, and it always comes back in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Uh, there's this. I just did this on the screen, and now I have little thumbs in bubbles coming up, so that's annoying. Um, uh, it but God keeps coming back and saying, because you were slaves in Egypt, because you were slaves in Egypt. And when he talks about always welcoming the alien and the stranger among you, because you were strangers and aliens in Egypt, it always comes back to that. You remember who you are and remember who I am. You're the slaves that I rescued, and I'm the God who is on the side of the slave. And it's repeatedly through the law we have this. And then we move from the law to the prophets, and um, especially uh, after Israel had kings, the first really great prophet in Israel was Samuel. And Samuel was the one who tried to tell him, you don't want a king. You don't want a king. Trust me, you don't want a king. And they want a king. So after we have kings in Israel, that's when we really have the rise of the prophets, because the prophets were not only, sent to preach to the people, but they were primarily there to deliver God's message to the kings and to the like the aristocracy, because inherent in having a king is the very real uh, probability of poor people getting oppressed. And so repeatedly, God sends prophets to think about like Elijah and King Ahab, and or even like Nathan with King David. Because David, there was a real abuse of power there with Bathsheba, and Nathan the prophet comes in and tells him the story about this man that has one lamb, and then the rich man across the street, basically, who has all these flocks, and takes the other man's lamb and kills it to serve to his friends. And David is outraged, because he used to be a shepherd, and so he's like, "Oh, that's terrible," and Nathan says, "That's you. You have this palace and you have all these wives and everything, and then you go and steal this man's wife, and then you send him up to the front line so that he'll be killed in battle." Um, so the prophets are there to confront the kings, and specifically, the the rich, the powerful in general, and later on that includes the priests too. And Because the priests are abusing their power and privilege as well to oppress the poor, uh and so we've got several examples from the prophets. This is from prophet Amos, who says, "You sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. You trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land. I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight, and I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentation." And then Isaiah says, "You who make iniquitous decrees," and so that's obviously about kings or people, rulers, people in authority, "who write oppressive statutes to turn aside the needy from justice and to rob the poor of my people of their right." Uh, I got a staple in way. "That widows may be your spoil, and that you may make orphans your prey. What will you do on the day of punishment and the calamity that will come? To whom will you flee for help? For all this, that is, all of God's anger, has not turned away." And in Micah, "Alas for those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it, because it is in their power. They covet fields and seize them, houses, and they take them away. They oppress the householder and the house, people and their inheritance. Therefore, thus says the Lord, now I am devising against you an evil from which you cannot remove your necks, and you shall not walk haughtily, for it will be an evil time." So there's many others, and there's lots of references given here. And so, the prophets continue with their calling for justice. And as this reminds us, we think about justice, we think of creating a level playing field, treating everybody the same, being equally fair. Well, that's good. Those are good and right. But justice for the prophets is something more than that. Justice means doing what God did in Egypt, hearing the cries of the oppressed slaves and delivering them, identifying with the lost and the least, and bringing about their redemption. And so when Amos says, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream," it's not a level playing field as so much as it is a tilt toward the powerless. Just like in Egypt, when, you know, God like very clearly opposed Pharaoh, and it's like, no, it's these slaves. These are whom I will side with. We look in the Psalms. There's some examples from Psalm 82, Psalm 68, Psalm 72. Uh, Psalm 72 is one of the royal psalms. Psalm 72 is the psalm that Isaac Watts based the hymn Jesus Shall Reign on. And that psalm talks about the king who has a long reign, will reign as long as the sun endures, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a long statement that Israel's king will enjoy a long life and a prosperous reign if he delivers the needy when they call and the poor when they have no helper. That the king is to be the chief lobbyist for those who lack the power and wealth to hire their own, thus representing God's major interest. And there's more Psalms. And then we get to the New Testament. Uh, and right there in the first chapter of Luke, we've got the Magnificat. Mary finds out that she's going to give birth to Jesus, and she says that God is the one who pulls down the mighty from their thrones and exalts the lowly, that he has filled the hungry with good things and he has turned the rich away empty. That this again, this great reversal that we see all the way back into Egypt, uh, is carried through into the New Testament. And when Jesus, and we just talked about this one in Sunday school a couple of weeks ago, when Jesus reads the God, the not the gospel, the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue, he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor," which in Isaiah is a reference to that year of Jubilee. When all the indentured servants go free, all the land reverts back to its net, to the original owners, and all the debts are canceled. And of course, we saw this week, Matthew says in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," but Luke just says, "Blessed are the poor." Uh, uh, but Jesus says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. And we've got several other examples. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. And then, of course, Matthew 25. "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." We've got the story of the rich young ruler. Uh, we've got the story of Dives and Lazarus. The rich man and Lazarus. Uh, and of course, the rich man uh, is oblivious, and Lazarus is at his door every day, and he just walks on by and just ignores him. And they both die, and the rich man is in a place of torment and of fire. The poor man dies and goes to reside in Abraham's bosom. The rich man pleads with Abraham, "Send someone back to earth to warn my brothers, so that they may repent and not suffer this anguish." To which Abraham replies, "Let your brothers read Moses and the prophets. They have already been more than adequately warned." And so it's like, just like we've seen, this is all through the law and the prophets, of that you don't neglect the poor, that you don't ignore, exactly what this rich man did. Uh, and it even goes on to say, uh, if they won't listen to what they've already got in the law and the prophets, then even somebody coming back from the dead isn't going to convince them. Uh, in the in the epistles, Paul says, uh, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. And you think about back to the Exodus story. God says to Israel, I didn't choose you because you were the greatest nation on earth. And you read, and we've all seen the movie, they weren't, they weren't like the most spiritual people. Uh, And he's like, and it's throughout, Moses, loses his cool with them so many times, how stubborn they are, how stiff-necked they are, that they're constantly complaining, and and God's like, yeah, well, I didn't choose you because you were these wonderful people. You were the least of all the peoples on the earth, and that's why I chose you. Not like, in spite of that, I chose. No, that's why I chose you, because this God is just on the side of the poor and the marginalized and the downtrodden, over and over again. Uh, so, and then there's an application here at the end of, in our own time, of, that we have such a great inequality. Now this says in 2001, so this is quite a few years old. This came out in 2007. 5% of America's population possessed 59.4% of America's wealth, while 40% of America's population possessed 0.3% of America's wealth. Now, and it says, since 2001, that wealth disparity has increased. I mean, I don't even know what it is now. It's a lot worse. It's a lot worse now. And we were talking, and mentioned in Sunday school, you know, uh, of course, we can't. These things are for us, and like the Beatitudes we talked about on Sunday. The Beatitudes are for us. They're for the church. It's not like we can force everybody to have show Christian charity. But when the church acts like this, the world takes notice. In the early church, I'm in a Tuesday night Bible study, and we're studying the book of Acts. And the early church, they took care of one another. And it says, and the God added daily to their number those who were being saved, because people took notice of how they took care of each other. But uh, it is frustrating to see so many who do have the means to do so much good, and to help so many people, and but what they want to do is just to, like the man in the parable that builds the bigger barns. I'll just build bigger storehouses and hoard all this food. It's like, when when in the world are you going to eat all that food, right? You got enough food to feed your whole tribe here, or your whole, area, and you're gonna build these big barns. Of course, in the story, God says, "Oh, they're gonna die tonight," and then, what good is all those big barns full of grain gonna do you? Um, we mentioned in Sunday school Sunday, in talking about the Beatitudes, there are some people who understand that there is that to whom much is given, the much is required. I told them the story on Sunday of a man that was, it was in the church where I worked in Louisiana, but it was before my time. But they all told me about him. He was very prosperous. I don't know what he did, uh, but he was very prosperous and successful. And he said, because they were talking about like the tithe. Now, totally off topic, but I think, like I said earlier, the tithe was something that was for Israel, because of the way their land was set up, that the Levites didn't have land. And so everybody else giving a tenth of what they grew or raised to support the priest, so the priest would have food. That's where the tithe comes from. We move to the New Testament, and you got the principle of giving, but you don't have tithing as like a law anymore. Paul just says, you give generously without compulsion. So it's like there's not a formula. It's just, God loves a cheerful giver. So this man, they were talking about tithing apparently at the church, and he said, you know what? He said, I can live very well on 10%. And so he gave 90. He gave 90 because he knew what he needed to live on, and he gave the rest. Um, I remember we had a man at our church in Hattiesburg, and only reason I know this is because being on staff, I didn't know this, and the only reason I know this is because uh, the accountant who did our taxes also did his taxes, and she wasn't like ratting him out. I mean, this was a good thing. She was just commending him. He he would give her all his stuff at the end of the year, and he'd say, Nancy, I just want to know one thing. Did I give did I give 10% to First Presbyterian Church? And she'd say yes and okay. If she said, well, no, he'd say, well, what's the difference? And he'd write a check for the difference and take it to church. So, there are people who kind of get it. And on Sunday, we talked about the fact that, Bill Gates used to be the richest man in the world. And he's not anymore. Because he and his wife give it away. They have this foundation and they're trying to use that to help people. Uh, uh, so, there are people who get it. There are people who don't get it and who are just about, like the guy in the story that Jesus told, building bigger barns, just increasing and piling it up. And for what? For what? Uh, but you know, we can't make somebody, you can't make somebody else have a conscience. We can't make somebody else have a conscience, but we as the church, we as Christians, we can do what we know is right. And like in the book of Acts, I think the world will take notice and does take notice. World certainly takes notice when we're hypocritical. When we say all the right things, but then we behave in a greedy manner. Uh, remember in the 80s with the televangelist stuff with Baker and Jimmy Swaggart and all of this. Uh, there was a country song that came out. It's called "Would Jesus Wear a Rolex on His Television Show?" Uh, so the world takes notice when we're like that, when we say these great things, and then our actions are the opposite. They certainly take notice, but maybe the world doesn't take notice when we do what is right because maybe we don't do what is right often enough for them to take notice. But if the book of Acts is any indication, and that's not the only example of that in the history of the church. Geneva was a great example of that with Calvin because they closed uh, the monasteries and the convents, and they turned them into schools and hospitals. And the deacons fed people every day that were poor. But again, in living out, in taking seriously this, that this is the kind of God that we serve, is this God that's on the side of the poor. So we're going to make sure that everybody, of course, they want everybody to have an education so they can read the Bible, but we want to make sure that everybody has an education. We want to make sure everybody that's sick gets the care they need. We want to make sure everybody that's hungry gets food every day. And this was the church that is doing this. So there have been examples in the history of the church kind of getting it and living that out. All right, other thoughts. Neil, you've been so like
Well,
in yes, quiet the whole time.
Eh, eh, Mark and I have talked about this, and it's our belief, whether it's right or wrong.
Uh-huh.
I'm hoping that I'll find out someday, but we really believe that when you give, the Lord gives back.
Mm-hmm.
That he really does bless you if you bless others.
Mm-hmm.
And
If
yeah,
he doesn't
and
bless
so-
you in your bank account, he blesses.
I was gonna say it might not be, oh well, I gave this person $50 and God's gonna give me that $50 back. But let me tell you a story.
Uh-huh.
Let me tell you a story. So back when I was out of seminary, I was out of grad school. No, I was in grad school and doing my master's in music. And I was preaching at this now I didn't have later on I got like a weekly preaching gig at a little PCUSA church that was right on the railroad tracks, and that was fun because the train would come by and I'd have to stop. And it was always come by in the middle of the prayer, and I'd have to stop.
You need to go to Argyle. So.
Yeah,
That's big, right?
it's funny because like you could feel it coming before you could hear it coming, and then you just have to stop
And in Argyle, there's
until
one
it
track.
passed by.
There's not one track, there's two
Oh
tracks.
man. But before that, I would get calls because, like I said, I was a seminary graduate, but I would get calls every now and then to preach here and there. And it was a little church out in the country. I'll never forget it because this church out in the middle of nowhere, and you walk in and they had this pipe organ, and I'm like, where did a church like this get this pipe organ? So asking somebody after church, uh, and a guy in the church built the thing.
Hmm.
He's just like, the church doesn't have an organ. I'm going to build us one, like you do, right? But anyway, that morning we were poor. Uh, I was working retail, and my wife was working. She was a vet tech, and we didn't have any kids yet, but we were poor. And so I was going to the country. She was going to First Pres in Hattiesburg, which is where we were members. And she had the checkbook, and she's like, because we'd made a pledge, monthly pledge. She's like, she's like, if I write our check to the church, we're gonna have like, $7 left or something. And and I said, yeah, go ahead and write it. And so I go and I preach at this church that morning, and uh, I like it when they hand me the honorarium check, afterwards somebody does. And I always had this thing. I would never look at the check at the church. It was just a thing I did, put it in my pocket. And then I'd drive down the road and I'd find like a convenience store and I'd go get my Diet Coke, for the drive back. And then I would look at the check. I just never, I didn't want to
See whether you can get large. Or...
Well, I know I didn't want anybody at the church to see me looking at the check or, I just always so I get back and actually I went in, I got my Diet Coke and my vanilla moon pie first, and then come back to the car and uh and then I look at the check. And the check was for a lot more than it was not the typical honorarium. It was more. Um and also at the church, this the man who built the organ and his wife, I had been talking to them, and she had a German accent. I remember that. I've been talking to them before the service, and about the organ and about how in the world did you do this? Anyway, after the service, when I come in through the shake hands line, and he put some cash in my palm, which I also didn't look at until I got back in the car. and I forget how much it was, but it was totally not, that doesn't happen. People don't,
Yeah.
that happens on Christmas Eve. Sometimes we had an elder in the church in Louisiana who would do that on Christmas Eve, but still. So I'm at the Circle K and I've got my Diet Coke and my vanilla moon pie, and I hear this German woman, young man. And I'm like, oh, she saw me looking at the money, 'cause and I didn't know, but she came up to my car and she said, my husband just told me that he he didn't give you enough and he wanted you to have this too. So the combination of the cash that that man gave me was equal to the check that my wife wrote that morning. So I came back and I said, well, they gave me a nice honorarium and we also got our pledge money back. So sometimes it does, sometimes it can be a a monetary, but but not always. And it can be other things. We had a diaconal thing just 2 days ago.
Mary Ann and I, it's very frequently a nice, easy opening on a freeway as we're coming down. the road.
Yeah,
That's nice. That's nice.
And the next ramp's even more of a blessing than the last one, because I'm 71 years, 250 days old now, and next time it'll be 250 plus days, so.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, the neck doesn't turn as well.
So just to close with this, because it is almost noon.
Yeah.
Why are prosperous people not better acquainted with the plight of struggling people? That's an interesting question.
yes, yeah.
Well,
Some are, some that came up.
I say they are, because who is gonna give to the poor if it's not the prosperous? The poor didn't give to the poor.
They can't give to themselves.
Exactly.
That's the pulling yourself up from your own by your own bootstraps is a satirical. That was originally a
Yeah.
satirical describing something that is impossible.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's become this thing that people use as an out. Well, you just got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Well, that's not possible. That's,
Right.
And then how can struggling people among us be essentially invisible? And it makes people uncomfortable.
That's what I was gonna say, we don't wanna look.
Mm-hmm.
They're powerless,
Yeah,
so
Yeah.
there's no visibility.
they're powerless, and then
Yeah.
and if you don't have the means, and I used to I wouldn't say anything, but if I don't have the means to help somebody now, I kind of feel compelled to tell them that I can't, I don't have, I don't have anything. And I told Marianne yesterday on the phone, though when I was in Birmingham, I lived out of my car, not literally, but practically because I had so many part-time jobs. And so I always had like lunch packed or lunch and dinner or snacks or what. I always had like, in those little Velcro insulated bags pretty much anytime. And so there would be, people at the stoplights with the, we'll work for food or whatever, hungry signs. And I'd put my window down and I'd say, you want some? I got some food. You want some food? And because I never carry cash, so I never, I'm not going to hand them my debit card, uh, but 9 times out of 10, they'd be like, "Oh, that'd be great. Oh, here's a peanut butter jelly sandwich. Here's some we call them nabs, the little peanut butter crackers, and here you want a Diet Coke, if I had something and this is something that I started doing back when I was in college. There's the area of town where we would go out to eat. There are a lot of panhandlers, and if we got panhandled on the way to go get something to eat, I'd just say, "Well, come eat with us."
Yeah, I wish, like I said, at a different time in this office, how I wish I'd have had that man come
Right.
sit and
Oh,
eat
yeah.
with us,
Recently
and
on
I
our
have
last
never.
trip, we
Yeah.
drove by this guy that
Yes,
we didn't see
yeah.
him till it was
Uh-huh.
too late.
My
And
fault.
he's sitting out there with a sign, and I said, well, we're getting on the freeway, we can go to the next exit and come back and get and go buy them again, but we chose not to.
Well, I chose not to because I'm a nervous. I just said, no, I just
But-
can't. I can't.
Well, and then the last question on here is, does prosperity make us blind? Do you think prosperity makes people blind to the needs of others, or is it something else?
Well, I'm uncomfortable saying that makes us blind, because I think there's probably a lot of reasons prosperity gets in the way of things, but
Mm-hmm.
um, it certainly fills our day, prosperity.
Okay, yeah.
Well, and another thing that comes to mind, if we had to give that guy we saw, or whoever you see on the street, $20 bill, okay? Well, we could have given him 100, that wouldn't have moved the needle. Giving him $1,000 bill really wouldn't move the needle. I mean, you wouldn't want to do that every day for a year, but you certainly, at what point in time, is prosperity taking charge of what is appropriate to give to the needy, as far as monetary, but also in other
And
than
and that's
monetary
why,
ways.
and we have
How much time do you devote at the food bank, or how much time do you devote at these places?
well, and that's why we have in the Matthew 25 churches in the PCUSA, part of the mission is to address the systems, this systemic poverty. And so you have initiatives with, helping people, for just one example, I know there's a church that helps GED prep, that does GED prep classes, and then there's a fee to take the GED, and they'll cover that fee for people so they can get their GED, so they can get a better job. They also they provide daycare, cost-free daycare for the people that go through this program, that, so that while they work, they're caring for their children. There are very eminently practical things
Yeah, yeah. I
that
know
we can
it.
do to help alleviate the systemic poverty. Anyway,
And I know of, there are groups that they take donated clothing so that when people want to go to a job interview,
Mhm.
or,
Yes.
here's the appropriate dress for
Yes.
you to make that better impression. And yeah, yeah. And I do think also it's difficult, that first question about the plight of struggling people. Sometimes you don't really understand. Because I have to say, when I did my BSN and had to go do for my public health rotation,
Yeah.
I wanted to do children. And I remember, and I didn't grow up wealthy.
Uh-huh.
And I remember I walked into 2 or 3 places, and I had no conception of
Mhm.
how those people were living. So
Right.
I think sometimes you really don't know.
We don't, I think you're right. There's so much about the plight of you don't know, even if you think you know somebody else's story, you don't. There's so many more layers to the story that you don't know. So, on that note, I'll just say, next time, the next great theme of the Bible is God loves us. So that'll be next week. All right. Thanks so much. 11 o'clock live, or on or 11:10 live, or on Zoom.